Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and my guest again today is the distinguished author, physician, psychiatrist, educator, Dr. David Hamburg, who for a decade and a half presided over one of our nation's most prestigious philanthropic institutions, the Carnegie Corporation. Now, whenever Dr. Hamburg has spoken here before about his twin interests in the healthy development of our children and in the development of world peace that he pursued at Carnegie, in both areas he has emphasized prevention as the means of avoiding what he calls rotten outcomes. And that was no less true when, along with the late Cyrus Vance, formerly American Secretary of State, my guest co-chaired the distinguished Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict. Now, in his own personal approach to the Commission's work, a book evocatively titled No More Killing Fields, Dr. Hamburg shows how prevention and negotiation may, just may, keep us from self-destruction. Indeed, they must. The alternative is too much of a horror to contemplate. Yet I'd like to begin our program today by taking my guest back to a thought I'm afraid I didn't too successfully navigate into an intelligible question last time. It has to do with what future mechanism will most likely make a reality of Dr. Hamburg's fervent wish for what his impressive new book calls No More Killing Fields. Must it be a truly international body like the UN with one nation, one vote? Or will we best give peace a chance if the general practice of fairness and due process of essentially democratic nations is translated into world leadership and, to be frank, world power? Dr. Hamburg, is that a fair question?
Indeed it is. It's one of the great dilemmas that the Commission faced and was not really able to resolve, but we did cause a number of studies to be done, quite a number of studies, to try to get around the contours of this difficult problem with new information to the extent possible, and deeper analysis to the extent possible. And in one of the later chapters of this book, I try to present a fair case for each. That is to say, that at the center is the notion that for prevention to be really serious, to be effective, to have a chance of working against deadly conflict, there has to be international cooperation, and by and large sophisticated international cooperation, because these are very complex tasks. And so it means the strengths have to be pooled, burdens have to be shared, labor has to be divided. And how do you do that? At the moment, it's sometimes said prevention has no address. Prevention is a sort of to whom it may concern message. And that's the state of the art now, and maybe it will remain so. The two main options are the ones you stated for organizing the international cooperation on a systematic and reliable basis. One would be through the UN. The advantages of the UN, in essence, are that it is the one really universal organization. Everybody's in it.
And it's here.
It's here, and it has considerable legitimacy throughout the world, partly just because it is universal. But it is a forum where everybody can have his or her say from every angle and every remote corner of the world. It has a certain legitimacy, and at the present moment, for the next 5 years, it has extraordinary leadership in Kofi Annan, who fully deserved his recent Nobel Peace Prize. And it has units that are quite effective and helpful throughout the world. The World Health Organization, UNICEF on behalf of children, the United Nations Environment Program has improved considerably in recent years. There are a number of parts of the UN that are quite helpful. The UN Development Program is quite significant, along with international financial institutions like the World Bank in addressing the problems of economic development. So it has assets, and it has the world in it, and it has remarkable leadership, and it has a number of strengths. However, in the last analysis, as the Secretary General often says, it's only as strong as its member states. It can only do what the member states will let it do, and particularly the Security Council, and within the Security Council, particularly the Permanent Five, as Russia, China, Britain, France, and the United States. That was crystallized out of World War II. And so it is a fact that many of the countries in the UN still are dictatorships. And the dictators are exquisitely sensitive to potential interference in their internal affairs. They treasure the right to abuse their own people as they see fit. That is a norm that is being eroded, and Kofi Annan, among others, is doing everything he can to erode it. But the fact is there are many ways that obstacles can be put in the path of the necessary cooperation to prevent war through the UN. Those obstacles may gradually be overcome in time, and my book has a number of suggestions and ways of doing that. But the alternate case, and these are not mutually exclusive, in fact, is the coalition led by the Community of Established Democracies, which after all is an expanding community. Not so long ago it was almost entirely the United States and Western Europe, and now it's much more than that, India, for example. And so it is an expanding community. It has great strength, as you said, just on all dimensions, science and technology, economic, political, military. Must not be a coincidence that such vast power in so many dimensions resides in the established democracies. But they have the capacity to do a great deal. There's also a great deal of intellectual and moral ferment in the democracies right now, not in all of them, but in many of them, about this very problem. They've been extremely responsive to the challenge of the Commission, and they've taken a number of initiatives, for example, in the European Union and in the G8 and other organizations of the established democracies. So they've got the power, they've got certain principles that are well established, and they have, after all, in practice, ongoing ways of dealing with conflict resolution at an early stage, below the threshold of violence, or at least below the threshold of mass violence. Look, when we live in a democracy, we automatically grow up with a sense that there has to be give and take, there has to be sharing, there has to be helping, there has to be compromise. There are many ways of mutual accommodation, formal and informal. There is an independent judiciary and all of that. But there's also sort of the habit or style of negotiation. And those mechanisms built into the functioning of democracies go a long way toward preventing mass violence internally, and the same principles and practices are, in fact, quite useful throughout the world. And one of the recent discoveries, so to say, of the established democracies is that they can foster the building of democracy more and more throughout the world. It's not easy, it takes time, there are many mistakes, the transitions can be bloody, but on the whole, there is a powerful current running toward the establishment, the spreading of democracy through the world with the established democracies as catalysts. And I would say for the time being, the established democracies have more capacity to prevent deadly conflict than the UN, although a lot of what they will do is through the UN. They would act partly through the UN and partly outside the UN. And there are some dilemmas, even for those who most deeply believe in doing as much as possible of this through the UN. They still face the problem which Kofi Annan stated, I believe it was in relation to Kosovo, but he stated more generally, that what do you do if there's a genocide about to occur or underway, and you can't get action through the Security Council? Should you just stand aside and forget about it? So I think he's clearly hinting there that there are times when the UN is unable to respond in a deadly awful situation, and others must do so.
Indeed, the kind of situation that you described there, aren't those situations most likely not to involve the advanced democracies with their capacity to take preventative action between and among themselves and to depend upon negotiation? Aren't we talking about violence? Aren't we talking about killing fields that are very far removed from those democracies?
This is a very fundamental point. Far removed, and yet we're discovering less and less far removed all the time.
In their impact upon us.
In their impact on us. Our attitude has been, as in the case of Cambodia or Rwanda, while it's regrettable, it's very far away, it's long ago, and anyway the wench is dead, it's not really in our vital interest to be concerned. We regret it, but we cannot invest in trying to stop it. But what we've found increasingly is that there are a number of very bad effects of that sort of thing happening. The failure of states or of civil wars, a morass developing. It's a sort of breeding ground for endemic diseases, for mass migrations which cause great suffering and dislocation in the region and may precipitate regional wars, and for severe environmental damage which doesn't respect any national boundaries, and above all, of international catastrophic terrorism. These are breeding grounds for hatred, violence, and terrorism. So, and finally, let me say, there's also a kind of a demonstration effect. If a genocider can get away with it with impunity, that is noticed by other people who have genocidal inclinations elsewhere. So, as a practical matter, I think we have to look at our national interests in the established democracies, we and Europeans and Canadians and Japanese and so on. We have to look at that as being not so far away. That is, that there's no place so remote that it may not inflict very great damage on the rest of the world in a multiplicity of ways. And I think that is rattling us some now. We'd like to think of some of these messy, bloody situations as far away and not really bothering us except a bit emotionally. But it's much more serious than that. And so we have to find cooperative ways internationally to deal with it.
Of course, what I have heard, and you may not have heard the same things, more and more I have heard people who I never would have identified with such thinking saying, the hell with all of them. It's impossible. It can't be. They don't have your faith in eliminating the killing fields through negotiation. And there is that sense of American, at least, withdrawal.
Well, it's not only a matter of negotiation. I mean, fundamentally, the structure of the approach that I take in this book, which grows out of but goes beyond what was available at the time of the Commission's own report some years ago, is first of all, preventive diplomacy, which is some way or other of facilitating negotiation, often with third-party mediation. But there are ways of doing it much earlier and much more effectively than we used to realize. So that is important, there's no question. Where there's already a serious conflict brewing, it may be at the point of conflagration, but the better we can catch it before it reaches the point of conflagration, the better we'll all be. But there's also the longer-term consideration of international cooperation for democratic development, and that's very fundamental. There's no use our talking about we don't want to be bothered with compassion fatigue. We've helped those countries and nothing's happened. It's not true. Nothing's happened. In many places where we've helped, a great deal has happened. Look at the transformation of Europe and Japan after World War II. Look at what happened with South Korea. There are many places where good things have happened, but it's taken a long time and it's been difficult. But we have learned in the process from successes and failures, and I try to crystallize some of that in the book about international cooperation for democratic development. Right now, I think the hardest cases in general are the Islamic countries, and especially the Arab Islamic countries, and I touch on that near the end of the book, where terrorists are being generated in considerable supply, and a situation where many of the countries have dictatorial leaders and a very small, very rich elite and a very poor, very subjugated masses. A great deal of unhappiness, very few practical skills for the young people, very few economic or political prospects. And so they are frustrated and angry as they grow up and therefore readily susceptible to religious fanatics or political demagogues. It's not by any means limited to the Islamic world. That problem exists in various parts of the world. But I believe, and try to explain in operational terms in this book, that if we can get enough international cooperation, again, particularly among the established democracies, to make the kind of determination to stick with it, as we did say with South Korea, that 30 or 40 years from now, you could find flourishing democracies with reasonable prosperity in many places which are today very poor and in bad shape.
You don't think the problems are so intractable?
They're human. They're human. They're by and large intelligent and innovative people all over the world. To a large extent, it rests on what kind of opportunities they have. And the approach in international cooperation for democratic development has, first of all, come to recognize more the democratic part of it politically. That it's not very satisfactory to say, well, leave it with a dictatorship as long as we can do business. The democratic part of it has come more front and center, but also you have to have market-based economies so that there's a chance for prosperity to emerge. And I think there's plenty of talent out there, but it gets squashed early. I mean, one of the current emphases in development is on education. Even the support, international support of early childhood education. The things you and I have discussed in past years about what's good for kids in the United States is also good for kids in Cambodia. We're all human. We're much more simply human than otherwise.
I've wondered, as I read the book and as I read your formula is not the right word, but your prescriptions, and you are a doctor, I keep coming back to, in my own head, to a question that I've asked you before, and that is, what picture of the nature of human nature informs your belief that whether through the UN or through the large or the working democracies alone, not alone, but primarily through them, we can do what you believe needs to be done?
Well, I think we'll move in that direction just as a practical matter. I mean, with the world covered wall to wall with small arms and light weapons and quotes which do immense damage, and with the great danger of having weapons of mass destruction creeping around the world, I think that the risks will just get higher and higher. The damage will get higher and higher, and we'll say this can't go on. If it goes on for another half century or another century, what kind of humanity, if any, will be left? I think it's going to be a very practical matter of having to come to terms with the fact that it's now much easier to incite hatred and violence quickly, vividly, all over the world, and our destructive power is much greater than it ever was. So as a practical matter, we have to come to terms with it. Is it easy? No. We carry a lot of baggage. I believe we're a very aggressive, contentious species. The operative word in the commission was deadly, preventing deadly conflict. We don't think you can prevent conflict. Conflicts are ubiquitous, as far as we can see, always will. I think it is a part of human nature. There was, as you may recall, a period in my career when I was deeply concerned with evolutionary research. And I came out of that convinced that the long, long line leading to the human species through millions of years is one that has much aggression in it. Now, mind you, a rather poignant and an important aspect of it is that the aggression is also tied to affiliation, attachment, the positive emotions. We give away our lives in the service of those we love. We identify with some sort of primary group. It may now be as large as a nation state, even a big nation state, but we identify with some human group that for us is survival. And I think we come out of that tradition where the human group was survival. And so on the one hand, it's very important to be attached and to belong and to obey the cultural norms and to believe in your group. On the other hand, it's very natural to be suspicious of other groups who may do you harm. That's a long part of our history. And I think we have to come to terms with that, broaden our identifications, and come to think eventually in terms of one human species, very meaningfully attached worldwide, and having to cooperate as a practical matter in a way that's far beyond what we did in the past. It's not easy. It's not something if it had been easy, we would have done it a long time ago.
What are the tools? What are the mechanisms for achieving that very difficult task?
Well, I think that the center of it is recognizing that there have to be cooperative mechanisms, and that the cooperative mechanisms, like we were discussing earlier, really address what I like to call superordinate goals. That is, goals that are so important that all of us have to cooperate in order to achieve them. The adversarial parties may have to drop their fighting because, well, take the issue most vividly for us, of course, in the past year is the catastrophic terrorism. It has elicited, at least for roughly a year's time, considerable cooperation among nations who weren't very cooperative before. And the sense is that if such terrorists get hold, let's say, of a nuclear weapon, it might be New York, it might be Washington, it might be St. Petersburg, Moscow, Paris, London, Beijing. I mean, everybody is vulnerable. Everybody's concerned. And there is this vivid sense going across not only the democracies, but many of the non-democracies of the world, that this ball game of terrorism with more and more deadly weapons, and even weapons of mass destruction, will require cooperation and to some degree setting aside hostile assumptions we made before. Now, we don't have to love each other, but we have to work together in order to deal with a very serious problem. And it is a kind of superordinate goal that we can only reach by cooperation.
And by the use of force.
If necessary, sometimes. The international cooperation for democratic development could, in time, build much more satisfactory countries around the world, which would breed fewer and fewer people susceptible to the terrorist appeal. But to the extent that you're dealing with established terrorists who are out to do the maximum possible damage, then yes, military, police, intelligence considerations become exceedingly important.
Now, we're taping this program at the end of April 2002. Be on the air in a few weeks when people see it. Do you anticipate that we will be in a position where things are worse or things are better?
In a few weeks, I don't know. On a time scale of a year or two, I expect we will have in the world, I don't know whether in the United States or elsewhere, we will have in the world other very severe terrorist episodes. I don't think we're through with them yet. I think there are too many established terrorists, and there's been too much appeal, a kind of contagion. I don't think it's going to go away very soon, but I think we although we need to address the practical aspects of that very seriously. I'll give you one example. The Great Nunn-Lugar program, which was a way of helping Russia safeguard its nuclear and bacteriological weapons after the Cold War and try to prevent leakage of the weapons of mass destruction and the people who could make weapons of mass destruction throughout the world. That program needs to be intensified. I mean, for example, it doesn't now cover tactical nuclear weapons, which are in fact most attractive to terrorists. So measures of that kind need very badly to be taken, and not only between us and Russia, but we and the Russians actually ought to lead a worldwide coalition to deal with that sort of issue, to safeguard weapons from theft and bribery and accidental firing. So there are very practical political military matters that will be of great importance for probably decades to come. But in those decades, we oughtn't to be assuming that the conditions of the world remain the same. We ought to be doing everything in our power to make democratic, political, and economic development spread throughout the world. It is spreading now, but to make it spread more rapidly and more effectively.
Again, what are the present mechanisms for that you find most hopeful?
It's a mixture. Certainly today, the role of the private sector in economic development is much more prominent than it was 20 or 30 years ago. The role of investment and trade. Take the South Korea case again. Pat Haggerty, the late chairman of Texas Instruments, once said South Korea was like the 51st state for a while, in the sense that we really took hold of it and invested in it and fostered trade with it and fostered regional cooperation around it, even in very difficult circumstances like the traditional Japanese-Korean hostility. We made an all-out effort, including a large private sector effort, to improve economic conditions there. We were a little slow on the uptake about democratic political conditions, but there, in due course, we moved, and not just the government, and maybe not even the government in the lead, but non-governmental organizations would become immensely more important than they were. Incidentally, in whether you take a UN-led model or a democracies-led model for international cooperation, the non-governmental organizations today will be very important, far more than they would have been 20 years ago. And many of them are zeroed right in on human rights and democracy and decent human relations.
Taking lead, I presume, are foundations in America.
Foundations have supported the NGOs to a very large extent, and they're not all terrific, but on the whole, I think a number of the conflict-oriented, conflict resolution, conflict prevention-oriented NGOs have done wonderful work. The Carter Center, the International Peace Academy, the Center for Preventive Action at the Council on Foreign Relations, to name a few. The Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington is mixed. It has government support and private support. The NGOs have all kinds of mixtures, but yes, foundations have taken a lot of initiative, and I'm proud to say Carnegie was one in building up those NGOs that tended to be effective either in the preventive diplomacy side of things or in the democratic development side of things.
Dr. David Hamburg, I appreciate it so much when you come, mostly because you were so doggone enthusiastic and optimistic, and I know that we need that. And I appreciate your being here again.
Well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you.
And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977. FDR Station, New York, New York, 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.